the July 25th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at a much busier weekend of racing than the one we recapped the prior week. Saratoga did open 2 weeks ago, but it seems like things really picked up this past week around the country. Del Mar opened on Friday, Monmouth Park ran their Haskell Day on Saturday. We had some big speed figures from elsewhere in the country, so a lot of racing to recap on this podcast, Craig. Obviously, though, a lot of eyes were trained on Monmouth Park Saturday. The big race there was the Grade 1 Haskell, and I think that race really set up an intriguing matchup that we're likely to see among these three-year-olds both later in the year in the Travers and then looking even further ahead to the Breeders' Cup Classic.
Not always do the big races deliver, but I think the Haskell did in a big way. We saw a couple of really nice performances, and we saw some on the whole card. And I'm with you. This was a really big week of racing. There were plenty of races we're not going to talk about that we could have added to the rundown, but we only have so much time. So we're going to cover the bigger ones. And yeah, it's just really that fun time of year where for the next several weeks, I'm sure we're going to see many big performances like we saw from Go Rocket Ride.
Well, let's dive into the racing, and we'll begin by discussing that Haskell card and the feature race at Monmouth Park on Saturday. Go Rocket Ride, Craig. You know, neither of us really liked him when we did our handicapping of this race, but I did mention towards the end of our Haskell analysis that even though I'm not picking this horse, feels like the kind of horse that might slip through the cracks for the bettors, and that is indeed what happened. He went off at 12-1 in this race, which you could argue was pretty generous on a horse with the upside and the form that he had coming into this race, and boy did he deliver in a big way. I will say, Mike Smith gave this horse an absolutely perfect ride. He drew the rail, but got him immediately off the inside, heading into that clubhouse turn. He was just able to work out that unencumbered stalking trip to the outside, but the horse really delivered when he was asked for his best. Richard Mandela, when he ships across the country, generally he means business, and that was the case with Go Rocket Ride.
And everything you said, I saw the same thing. I thought it was a great ride. The horse really stepped up and delivered, just second race off the layoff. And like we said on some of our other shows, it's the 3-year-old division is wide open, and he's thrust himself right near the top of it with that effort. I guess he's shipped back west, is going to try the Pacific Classic next against older horses, but I wouldn't underestimate him based off of this effort. He wound up with a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, and if I had to guess which way he's going to go, I would say forward off of this one, given how lightly raced he is.
Yeah, I mean, this was just his second start off a layoff. Obviously had that unplanned break as he missed the Santa Anita Derby, had a setback, and took him a little while to get back to the races. But obviously that race out in California that he won was just a prep because he took a big step forward to win this Haskell. And as you said, probably going to finish off his season with the Pacific Classic and then with the Breeders' Cup Classic being in California this year. That's obviously the long-term target, but definitely a lightly raced 3-year-old that's moving in the right direction. As for the Kentucky Derby winner Mage, Craig, I thought that this race probably served its purpose for him. He was coming off a slight layoff, having not raced since the Preakness, and you had to like what you saw from him. He broke pretty well for him, settled into a pretty good trip. Looked like he might have a shot at winning the race at the top of the stretch, and he flattened out a little bit late, but he loses nothing in defeat.
No, not at all. And just to show how tough a game horse racing can be, I would say I was dead right about Mage and his Preakness basically being a toss for several reasons. I thought he ran well. He just got beat by a better horse on this day. The connections had said that he probably wasn't fully cranked up, and I think we saw that a little bit as he ranged right up to Go Rocket Ride. Looked like he might go by and just faded a little bit in the stretch. And if what they say is correct, and this horse has another level to get to, and the Kentucky Derby would indicate he does, he's going to be very dangerous in the Travers.
What did you make of some of the lightly raced runners coming in here, both Arabian Night and Extra Anejo? You could argue that both were slightly disappointing. They finished 3rd and 4th in this race, but 3rd and 4th in the Haskell is nothing to sneeze at. It's just that expectations were pretty high for both of those coming into the race.
Thought they both ran well. Arabian Night, he dueled, and we have the opening fraction coded in red. It was a 150 plus pace figure. He hung around pretty well, and to me, it was pretty impressive he was able to get third. He was obviously way over bet because of the Bob Baffert name, but I still think he ran well. He wound up with a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, 4 points of pace boost because of that fast early pace, and if he can stay healthy, which I guess you have to question given it was just his or third race of his career, if he can, I would expect him to move forward off of this one as well. I thought it was a good effort. As for the fourth place finisher, Extra Anejo, I thought he ran fine. It's not really mentioned at the comments, but watching live, I thought his race he lost it at the gate. It wasn't like it was a terrible break. He just didn't get out. He lost a lot of position. He wound up being wide on the turns. I'm not sure he's quite as good as the three that finished in front of him, but I'm not willing to write him off just yet off that race.
Yeah, I agree with most of those sentiments. Arabian Night obviously lost as the heavy favorite, and you could argue he was overbet in this race. But I thought he showed some likable attributes in defeat. I mean, it's not like he completely threw in the towel when Go Rocket Ride and Mage went past him at the top of the stretch. It even looked like John Velasquez eased up on him a little bit at the eighth pole, but this horse just on his own accord kept running through the wire. And the thing that really struck me watching Arabian Night in this race is he is such a beautiful mover. I mean, he just floats over the ground. When they broke out of the gate, a few horses had some trouble coming out of the starting gate. It was just like he was immediately into position, just kind of gliding into that clubhouse turn. And I think it was that classy stride that propelled him to third place by a clear margin here, not, really fading at the end of this race. Given that it was off such a long layoff, I'd be intrigued to see him in a race like the Travers. I don't think that Bob Baffert has yet decided where he's going with this horse, and you could correct me if you've seen reporting about that, but I think Bob's probably going to take him back to California and see how he trains in the upcoming weeks. But he's a horse that I think would deserve to be in that race, definitely having this start under his belt. You would imagine he could go forward from there. And as for Extra Anejo, I agree. He did not break that well, was just kind of out there in no man's land, wide, a little further back than you might have expected for much of the race. He was actually last heading into the clubhouse turn, into the far turn, I should say. And he, despite that wide trip, stayed on decently while never really threatening here. I think he got the distance okay. He just feels like a horse that is going to need a more forwardly placed trip if he's really going to be effective at this level. Craig, the horse that was disappointing for me was Tapit Trice. Not so much because of the horse's performance. I don't understand the rides that Luis Saez gives this horse anymore. It's like one of those toxic relationships where like you expect the other person in the relationship is going to do something bad even before they do it, and you kind of overreact to everything that they do, and it just feels like that's Luis Saez with Tapit Trice these days. I mean, yeah, he broke a little bit slowly, but he's pumping on him out of the gate like he's trying to get him forward when he's already at the back of the pack, and just ride this horse like it's a closer because he is a closer, and it just seems like at this point in time this jock is not the right fit for this horse. Maybe he's finished and there's no upside for him, but if they move on to the Travers with Tapit Trice, I think they've got to try something new.
I have no problem with that. Obviously, it's not working with Luis Saez. It does seem like he's a difficult horse to ride, and maybe he just doesn't fit his style. We know Luis Saez likes to be aggressive, likes to get good forward position, and that's just not going to happen with this horse. I mean, I didn't think he ran very well despite the ride, but maybe that had something to do with it, and a change could do well because this was certainly a race where just dropping out of it and making one like late run would have served him a little better, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the trouble's not noted in the comment line, but I mean, he moved up down the backstretch. And I think the pace line is important to note in this race because after that really fast first quarter, you could see in the pace line in Timeform US, they really moderated the pace on the backstretch, and you could kind of see it in the way the entire field bunched up. I think first to last was covered by about less than 3 lengths with a half mile to go, and he tried to ride Tapit Trice up into that pocket on the inside in behind those 2 long shot leaders that you knew were going to back up, and he ended up getting completely shuffled pulled out of the race on the far turn when those two predictably faded. And I think you just, when you're riding a closer, you have to be a little smarter than that and not try to follow those long shots that you know are going to back up in your face when you're on a long striding one pace type like Tapit Trice. So maybe they'll try something different next time, but you would have thought they might have done so already with a horse like that. Let's move on to the other grade one on this Monmouth Saturday card, the grade one United Nations, going the 1 3/8 distance on the turf. And Craig, a lot of people were surprised at the winner of this race, Therapist, one that I think earlier in his career most would not have pegged as a future Grade 1 winner going a marathon distance on the turf. But in the Mike Maker barn, this horse has found himself going these longer distances. And we saw that improvement over the winter at Gulfstream, and he proved it was no fluke here, as he was just best in this race. He won by a decent margin, even though he went off at 12-1, didn't get a whole lot of respect among the runners from the Mike Maker barn here, but Javier Castellano gave him a good ride, and he's just a different Therapist right now.
It is, and the only thing I can say is it's Mike Maker. You just can't ignore him in these races at 11 furlongs and 12 furlongs. It doesn't matter what the history of the horses is, doesn't matter how cheap they've run, what their distance limitations were in the past. He seems to be able to get these horses to go long, and he did it with Therapist. He got back to a 120 time figure, TimeformUS speed figure, the same we saw him run in the Appleton at a 1.5 miles at Gulfstream. So he's just always going to be dangerous in these spots. He ran 1-3 in this one, and um, it was just kind of a perplexing rate. I was really surprised Catnip was bet so heavily, and he actually ran pretty well. I mean, he was only beat a length and a half, but as you said, Therapist was clearly best. It wasn't like there was a pace meltdown or anything like that. It just kind of all the best horses got kind of decent trips, and he was the best of them.
And I know a lot of people express some skepticism when Mike Maker turns around a horse like Therapist. I mean, Craig, what I'll say about Mike Maker is that he does something that a lot of other trainers don't try to do, and that's claims these older back class horses that generally have form going shorter, and he just decides to try something they haven't done before and go longer with them. It's kind of like the same philosophy that a lot of steeplechase trainers have when they'll get flat horses that have form going shorter, and the philosophy is that, okay, these horses are a little off form, they can't deal with the faster paces or the quick starts of some of these shorter races in their older age. Let's give them a more relaxed pace and a easier trip over these longer distances. And we see it work a lot with those steeplechase horses, and it's kind of a similar phenomenon here that Mike Maker is able to achieve with these horses like Therapist. Personally, I was never one of those people that was of the opinion that Therapist was some turf sprinter. I know everybody always had this idea about this horse that he was best going shorter because he won a bunch of short races when he was a very young horse. But if you looked at his speed figures, all of his best speed figures were over the longest distances they had run him. So I mean, there was some evidence to suggest that a lot of people had this horse pegged wrong all along. But we've seen Mike Maker do this a lot, and it just is something that works with these older battle-hardened horses. They appreciate a new kind of task, and Therapist was able to to be successful here. I agree, I didn't expect Catnip to take that much money, but he obviously ran well. Red Knight was the disappointment in this race. He'd already achieved a grade 1 victory at the age of 9 a little bit earlier this year in the Man of War, and just couldn't quite run back to that same level here. He stayed on to get a piece like he often does. But overall, Craig, I don't want to make too much of the fact that Therapist becomes a grade 1 winner in this race, because like we talked about last week, this was not the strongest grade 1 that you're going to see, even in this division.
No, he ran a 120 speed figure, which is more like a grade 2, maybe even grade 3 on turf. He caught a weak field. His stablemate Red Knight was the favorite, as you said. And like we talked about, you always have to be leery of deep closers at a short price. As good as Red Knight is, and as cool a story he is, more often than not, he's just not going to get there because of his lack of early speed.
The other turf graded stakes that they ran at Monmouth Park on Saturday, much earlier in the day, was the Grade 3 Matchmaker for the Fillies and Mares. This one going the shorter distance. And the Chad Brown trained Consumer Spending, able to run down her rival surprisingly. These facing off for the second time in a row. And, watching this race, Craig, it looked like Paco Lopez thought he had it won at the top of the stretch, with surprisingly kind of looking around. And suddenly there was Consumer Spending coming with her customary late run, and she was able to nail her on the wire. And it's amazing. Chad Brown has such depth in this division right now. Consumer Spending, as good as she was on this day, probably not even among his top 5 best horses in this division.
It's hard to say, really, because you never know. I mean, we were going to talk about other races where Chad Brown is not afraid to race against himself with various owners and various horses, and sometimes the ones that don't look quite as good as the others on credentials are able to get up and get the job done. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Consumer Spending isn't maybe a little bit better than the races she's been running in. She's won a couple Grade 3s of late. But I could see her stepping up and maybe trying to get that Grade 1 win that's eluded her so far, because she's got some real ability. We saw it last time. She overcame that slow pace in the Eatontown. This time the pace was more solid. It didn't seem to matter. She just has that really strong finishing kick.
Yeah, she really does. I mean, she motors home at the end of her races. I mean, and not a horse that really travels in the bridle. I mean, she had to come under a ride at the quarter pole, but when her jockeys ask her, she really responds, and she was able to use that kick to get up past Surprisingly, who is a good horse, but Consumer Spending has just had her number in the last couple of starts.
Speaking of numbers, I should say she ran a 122. I don't think I mentioned that. Surprisingly, a 121, and then a little bit of a gap back to Gam's Mission. But the top two ran well. And just to point out, like you said, the United Nations was a Grade 1 for older males, only got a 120. So this was an above par Grade 3 for fillies and mares.
Some other Grade 3 is later in the day on Haskell Day on the dirt. The Monmouth Cup was run as race 8. Proxy went off as the heavy favorite in here, and I think most people didn't expect him to do it from the front end, Craig, but I can't blame Joel Rosario for not trying to complicate things with a horse that just looked like he was better than these, and tried something new, putting him on the lead, and it ended up working out. Some dicey moments at the top of the stretch when Proxy, was Proxy, just got to idling a little bit, looked a little bit unfocused, but once Rosario got into him at the 8th pole, he just asserted his class.
That's a good word, because that's what it came across to me as, Proxy asserting his class. He didn't run a fabulous race. He only ran a 119 Timeform US speed figure, but I did think the change of tactics was interesting. I mean, this is a horse we haven't seen near the front end in a very long time. He's usually well off the pace, and Joel Rosario just went right to the front. There wasn't a lot of speed in here, and he was pretty game once he got his mind on racing. Whalen Springs kind of ranged up. Actually looked like he was going to go right by, but Proxy was just able to dig down, draw away, and just, as you said, exerted his class. I'm not sure where this one really fits. I know he's run well in some higher class races, but I'm not sure he's really a Grade 1 type horse. This seems about his level to me.
Another Grade 3 on the dirt run 2 races later was the Molly Pitcher, this one for the Fillies and Mares, and an upset here, Craig, as the horses that took all the money were both a little bit disappointing. Search Results and Loved, they vied for supremacy on the front end early. I would say they dueled themselves into defeat, although it's not like the pace was that fast. It just came apart a little bit. And Shotgun Hottie, who has really improved in the past couple of months for trainer Cherie DeVoe, seems like a horse that is really thriving at Monmouth Park. Boy, did she come through with a big effort. I mean, she won by half a length, but you can't argue that she wasn't the best horse, because she was legitimately 4 wide around both turns.
He was the best horse, and I don't really give too much of an excuse to Search Results and Loved. Yeah, they were dueling, but as you said, the pace wasn't fast at all. It does kind of show you that it's not always just those red-colored fractions. Sometimes it's just the pressure, and it was pressure for a long time, and maybe it just wore those two down. It's not like they ran terrible speed figures, but Shotgun Hottie was able to it's an interesting trip. As you say, she lost a lot of ground, but the way the race flowed, it's almost like it was counteracted by just sitting off the pace and picking up the pieces late. And she was able to hold off La Vida and just decent effort for her. 116 Timeform US speed figure, and if you look through her PPs, she just has a really nice forward progression going that's been going on all year, really.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say this as a red board. This was a good pick by our colleague Marcus Hirsch, who I know liked this horse a lot in the race. This is a horse that, looking back at a races, as I often do, when I'm wrong about a race, I go back and try to see how I could have gotten to the result. I think that's something you should always do as a handicapper, to just kind of, look at a race from a different perspective than the one that you had going into it. And when I went back and watched the last couple of trips, I feel like I kind of missed this horse because, I mean, she had a trip 3 back when she finished behind Distinctly Possible in that Serena Song, and she was just surprisingly impressive in her victory after that. And you could just, if you were deciding to go in trying to make the case that she was improving, you could have really gotten there, and she definitely did take another big step forward for Cherie DeVoe, who is having quite the past month or so. I mean, she had a stakes winner at Belmont, she won a race at Saratoga on this same day. I mean, her barn has really grown in quality over the past year or so, and it's just nice to see a different trainer really competing in these graded stakes on the national stage.
And I'm glad you said that because she is training really well. She obviously knows what she's doing with horses, and it's still not too late to bet her. She hasn't reached that point where she's getting bet at the windows, but if the results keep up like this, that day's going to come pretty soon. So take advantage while you can.
One more race to discuss from that Monmouth Saturday card. Very early in the day, actually the first race of the day, we saw a Chad Brown trained 3-year-old, Army Times. Actually, sorry, not the first race of the day, but the first part of the card. Army Times just dominate a field of older allowance horses. And I'm not really sure where this improvement came from, Craig. He was second off a layoff. I hadn't been too impressed by his debut. I mean, his maiden victory in the prior start, but he took a big step forward here to beat this field quite handily.
Did a giant step forward. I mean, he had broke his maiden, ran 100 speed figure at Monmouth for Chad Brown, which, we've seen him send some good horses to Monmouth, but it's generally not his best horses. But Army Times exploded to a 115 here. It wasn't the strongest field that you're ever going to see, but I mean, he was the second choice. There was a heavy favorite who just didn't really run very well, Subrogate, and he took advantage. He was pressed early, even though the fractions were slow. It's not like he was loping along on the front end. And when they hit the stretch, it was game over. He drew away big improvement all the way up to that 115. So who knows if he can reproduce that? He could be moving towards stakes races.
Yeah, he's out of the damn paid up subscriber who ran for Chad Brown as well, same connections. And appropriately, I think she won the Shuvi by some crazy margin. I think she won by like over 30 lengths. It was a very poor Shuvi field, but we'll be discussing the Shuvi very soon. And I kind of confused those Chad Brown horses, Craig, because he also did have a winner at the first race on Haskell Day. We're not going to spend much time discussing that one, but the winner of that race, Startup Mentality, a 3-year-old filly making her debut, was extremely impressive and looks like another good 3-year-old filly turf horse for that stable.
She does. She was one of the ones I was thinking of when I said we just don't have time to cover them all. But since you brought her up, I will pull up her speed figure. It was a 104 first time out. And I think if you go back and watch that race and watch her trip, you'll think that, like I do, there's probably a lot more in the tank for her.
Well, let's move over to Saratoga, and the first race we'll discuss there from this past weekend was the Grade 2 Shuvi, which they ran on Sunday. Disappointing field, Craig, obviously, in terms of size. I mean, only 4 runners, 2 of them just basically with no chance. I know that the racing office was planning on a field of 5 for this race, and unfortunately, the Phil Bauer horse that he was intending to run played hard. She came up with an illness and had to scratch. So, it went from being a horse with a big 3 to a big 2. The big 2, though, are really good horses in Nest and Clairiere. You would just like to see some sort of creativity to get more horses into these fields. It's becoming too much of a pattern in New York that they're just content to send forward these 4 and 5 horse fields in stakes races. It's not good for the bettors, and it's not a good look for the sport. So you want to see some more competition out there. But having gotten that out of the way, I mean, we will say it's nice to see these two do battle, and especially great to see Nest back in good form, because there's always that question mark when a horse is coming back for a new season, especially a filly or mare coming back for a new season off a long layoff, whether or not they'll still be the same horse. And Nest definitely the same horse, if not a little bit better as a 4-year-old.
She was, and as far as the speed figure goes, this was the only two-turn dirt race on the card. I played it straight, even though the pace was slow. I didn't do any kind of pace breakout or anything like that. Now, it may very well be built into the figure a little bit because it was the only one, but I wound up giving Nest a 123, 126 final time figure. Clairiere just a point back with a 122. Largely, that gap was closed from the 2 1/4 length margin because of that slow pace. And I think they both ran well. I don't want to just write Clairiere off. I saw a little bit of that on social media. This was basically a match race, like you say, and she was at a big pace disadvantage, in my opinion. So I think both of the top two ran well, and the results could very well change if they ever meet a field that has more runners that have some speed.
Yeah, this felt like just an appetizer for what we're likely to get in the personal ensign, later next month. If you watch harness racing, it almost felt like a qualifier that, neither of these two had the Shuvi as their primary target, but they're just trying to get to the next step. And, Nest was better on the day. The circumstances of the race definitely favored her. She's got that big turn of foot that we saw from her at Saratoga last year when she was so impressive winning the Alabama, and similar kind of trip here where she just was able to gradually range up on the far turn, and as soon as Irad Ortiz presses the button, Clairiere just can't match that instantaneous acceleration that Nest has, but they both stayed on well, and I think it's just on to the next step in the personal incident. Hopefully that field draws some other horses. You'd like to see some of the Molly Pitcher participants show up in that spot, as well as maybe Played Hard if she's doing well again. Secret Oath potentially pointing to that race. So let's hope that comes up a more competitive affair.
Yeah, I agree. It's always good to see good horses run, but you want to see them in actual races, not just the things like where you only get a couple horses who have no chance.
Let's move on to the Saturday feature. Was the Grade 1 Coaching Club American Oaks over that same mile and an eighth distance on the dirt, and another pretty small field here. I mean, it was unfortunate that Hoosier Philly didn't get to participate. She had a minor issue and was forced to scratch. Hopefully we'll see her back again soon. But it definitely made this race a little bit easier, Craig. Though not necessarily easier from a pace standpoint for Wet Paint, because she is that deep closer who likes to have some pace to close into. I wouldn't say that she really got it here, but she was still able to get up to nail the long shot Sacred Wish on the wire.
It's a betting race. I think this race lost a lot when Hoosier Philly came out down to a five-horse field. Not a lot of pace, so she's looking lucky. Set a pretty solid pace before backing out of it. I thought Wet Paint ran fine. She ran a 112 Timeform US speed figure. Sacred Wish was kind of the surprise in here. Ran a big race to be second. Actually got a 1 point faster speed figure for being up on that pace. But as we mentioned most of the year, the 3-year-old fillies, they've left a little bit to be desired. And you can kind of see that by as we move towards late July, they should be getting closer to the older fillies and mares like Nest and Clairiere. And there's still a pretty big gap to bridge before we get to the Breeders' Cup if they want to be competitive.
The big disappointment in this race was Gambling Girl, who lost by nearly 9 lengths. And, Craig, I kind of brought it up when we were doing our preview last week. That Kentucky Oaks, it was a real outlier compared to her prior form. I mean, she's always run well, but she had never run that kind of speed figure before, and maybe it was just the first start off a layoff and she'll build on it, but I mean, she really didn't have much to offer here, just barely getting up for third.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot going on with her in the race, just kind of bicycling around in the middle of the pack, never made a dent. I mean, this one wound up being a match race in the stretch.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing to me that Wet Paint didn't even go favored in here over Gambling Girl. I guess part of that is due to the Irad Ortiz factor, and it does feel like he's been winning every race at Saratoga, especially since his brother got injured last week. But I mean, you have to, weigh the merits of the two horses, and it just felt like Wet Paint was coming in with a much stronger resume. And I would imagine from here, she's going to be really tough in the Alabama coming up next month. And it does kind of set up an interesting discussion between the two Godolphin fillies for divisional honors. Obviously, Pretty Mischievous has a leg up with the two grade 1s already, and the Kentucky Oaks and the Acorn. They're not going to face off, though, because Pretty Mischievous is pointing to a cutback in the test, which I actually think makes some sense for her, and Wet Paint, the Alabama type. So it's going to be interesting to see how the resumes of these two Godolphin horses stack up by the time we get to the fall.
It is. I mean, pretty mischievous. If she wins the test, is obviously going to be strong. With that being another grade one, we'll have one grade ones at 7 furlongs and 9 furlongs. So that would be kind of a tough resume to run down unless Wet Paint's able to step up and beat older horses, which seems unlikely.
Let's discuss some other stakes action from Saratoga during the past week. Their Friday feature was the Grade 3 Lake George. We did lose one of the Chad Brown quintet that was entered in this race. I think he had 5 entered in here, 1 scratch. So he went with 4 starters, and they finished first, second, fourth, and fifth. Secret Money actually put in a pretty nice effort for Brendan Walsh to upset the Chad Brown superfecta, getting in there for third. But I think the two that we really need to discuss, Craig, are the top 2 finishers, and especially winner Surge Capacity, who I know you had given a very big speed figure to her debut race at Monmouth, kind of going out on a limb a little bit, because that was a race that I think you had much faster than some other figure makers, and she really validated it, coming through with another victory here against much tougher competition.
Yeah, when you say that, honestly, I don't really look at other speed figures, so I'm not going out on a limb other than I gave a high figure to a 3-year-old filly in her first start, but it kind of fit on the day, and these are the kind that make me really love my job when she's able to run back to it with the step up in class, leaving Monmouth, going to Saratoga, and just getting the job done. And not that she just got the job done, I clearly thought she was best, even though she only won by 3/4 of a length over tax implications. Seemed like that one had every chance to catch her and just couldn't quite get it done. And it's not like I'm knocking her. She ran fine as well. Another forward move up to a 113. Surge Capacity ran a 114. So these are pretty good figures for a grade 3 3-year-old filly.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm complimenting you, but I guess I should really be complimenting the TimeformUS algorithm, which you did create, Craig, which gave Surge Capacity a big pace upgrade for her debut race. And I think that's one of the great things about using TimeformUS speed figures, especially in the turf races, because it matters so much how these horses come home and the finishing speed that they're able to attain in the stretch. And we really do give horses pace upgrades and downgrades, even on the turf in slower pace situations. And that was the case for Surge Capacity debut. I think she had shown some real quality that day, closing off her own pace, and she was able to come through, like you said, different tactics here, but a nice step forward for her and good professionalism coming through on the inside. And watching this race visually, Craig, I mean, she is one tall drink of water. I mean, she has a lot of size to her, just kind of towered over her competition, and she was able to use that class in the stretch to beat her stablemate tax implications, going out for the same owner, Klarovich Stables. And she's been beaten by stablemates in the last couple of starts, but I mean, she's a good horse too, and was able to, close in a race that really was dominated towards the front end.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see which of these maybe show up in that Saratoga Oaks that we have coming up a little longer, but it doesn't seem like distance would be too much of a problem for either one of these two.
Let's move on to the other stakes race they ran on that Friday card at Saratoga, the Curlin. This one sometimes used as a prep for the Travers. It's sort of the the route for horses that haven't yet won a stakes race as 3-year-olds, as opposed to those top tier 3-year-olds that are probably going to go in the Jim Danby or the Haskell. And Scotland Craig, the winner of this race, is the kind of horse that you expect to see having success in the Curlin, and late developing, up and coming type. He had shown quality in his first 3 starts, had kind of been involved in a trio of photo finishes. He had come out on the winning end of a couple of them, the losing end of one of them, but a much more decisive margin in this Curlin, as he really got things his own way, able to use his tactical speed to get forward in a moderate pace situation.
Yeah, he's a horse who'd been moving forward speed figure wise gradually and then kind of exploded to that new 120 top that he ran on Friday. Nice effort from him. I'm not going to get too carried away. I've been suckered into these curling horses before when they try the Travers. Not sure I quite see that, but I guess his speed figures fit. It's just a matter of I've seen this case before, and this wasn't a very strong race when you look through the field, particularly when the heavy favorite Blazing Sevens really didn't show up.
Yeah, Blazing Sevens. I mean, if you were a little skeptical of that Preakness form, which I know that I was, he seemed like a beatable favorite in here. Unfortunately, I tried to beat him with Il Miracolo, who did run really well for second. He went off at 15-1 and took a huge step forward. He's a horse who had some subtle trips in some of those Grade 1 races. But those two, I mean, he and Scotland, they just kind of shared the lead. And I think that, even though the pace doesn't look that fast, in a small field, getting forward in these mile and an eighth races is always an advantage at Saratoga, and these two were just able to dominate on the front end. But like you said, Craig, even though Scotland got this 120 Timeform US speed figure, which puts him on the precipice of being competitive with some of the top 3-year-olds out there, the Curlin hasn't always been the most productive race looking ahead to the Travers, and I think a horse like this is going to get a much bigger class test next time out if that's where they do decide to go.
For sure. And I wonder, I assume that's where they're pointing. I know Bill Mott mentioned it as a possibility. And don't get me wrong, I'm not disparaging the horse. He's good. He showed new tactics. He had never really been on the lead before. So he obviously has some talent. I just want it's a pretty big step to go up from a restricted stakes like this, competing against those horses who have never won, to the best horses in the division.
Let's circle back to Saturday's card at Saratoga to discuss the undercard race they ran there, the Grade 3 Caress, this one going 5.5 furlongs on the turf for the fillies and mares. And another small field here, Craig, but I think we did see a pretty good winner of this race in Roses for Deborah, who is definitely a rising star in this division. Arguably didn't beat the strongest field here, but you had to like the way that she did it. This was a slow-paced affair. They really weren't moving on the front end, and while she was stalking the pace, these are the kinds of races where you typically see a blanket finish where the entire field sprinting to the wire, but her sprint is just superior to that of the others in this race. She was able to open up quite a margin over 2 lengths by the time they got to the wire.
Yeah, she's pretty good. And for me, that margin's even more impressive than it looks because the pace was non existent in this race, really. Bubble Rock went to the lead as predicted, just went so slow. I'm not sure it really mattered, wasn't good enough to hold on. And Roses for Deborah just put them all away in the stretch, including Wakanaka, who it's not like she was far back. She had shown to be a good closer in route races. So to kick away from that one in the lane, she was doing some serious running. She winds up with a 115 Timeform US speed figure, 116 final time, but I wouldn't be surprised if she could go faster if she needed to.
Yeah, this reminds me of that breakout performance that we saw from Caravel when I think she won this exact same race. I want to say 2 years ago. It was the race where she was privately sold after that. I think initially to Bobby Flay before she wound up with new connections in the Brad Cox stable later on. But it's that kind of performance. It was the first graded stakes win for Roses for Deborah, but feels like a horse that's going to have more of those in the future. And we're probably not going to see her race against Caravel just yet because I think Caravel will be facing males next time, and Roses for Deborah probably going to target the other race in this division. I think the Smart and Fancy later in the meet, but she feels like one that might have that kind of potential because something we talked about, or at least I think I mentioned when we did our stakes preview, is this turf sprint division. We can see horses transition their big speed figures from allowance to stakes company a little more easily than sometimes we do in some other divisions. And a horse that's a rising talent, they can often rise pretty far by the time they get to the end of the year in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, and you were dead right about her on the forecast. She was better than, or the race preview we did. She was better than her speed figures coming in, and I'm not sure she's still not better than her speed figures.
Let's discuss some of the non-stakes events from last week at Saratoga, just a couple of them to mention. I think Chad Brown has another pretty good turf horse, though a male version of a good New York bred in the Thursday allowance race that we saw Spirit of St. Louis win his second consecutive race on the turf. He is now 2 for 2 since getting on this surface. And Craig, this horse has been really impressive in both starts on grass so far. I mean, he made this gigantic late run from far back to win his turf debut at Belmont, and then in this race able to sit closer to the pace but still producing that big late kick. This is a New York bred that obviously has stakes in his future of the state bred variety, but maybe could be capable of even better than that down the line.
Yeah, based on this speed figure, he could. He ran a 118, did so winning easily. I mean, as easy as you can in a turf race. And he actually made me go back and look to see maybe if I missed something speed figure wise in his first turf race. But I don't really think I did. I think it just took him a little while to get going that day. He kind of raced to his competition. He still won as easy as could be. So I'm not sure what the limit is for this horse, but when you win your first two turf races by a combined 7 lengths, with good speed figures, it certainly seems like stakes are in his future. And as you said, I think he could even compete in open company.
And then we'll round out the Saratoga portion of this Pacecast with a Sunday maiden special weight race for the 2-year-olds. We've only discussed a few of the 2-year-old races so far at Saratoga on this podcast, but Sam's Treasure, I think, ran the fastest of the 2-year-olds that we saw at Saratoga this past week, winning this Sunday maiden race, earning a nice 105 TimeformUS speed figure. And experience paid off, Craig, because she was one of the runners who already had a start under her belt, albeit on the turf, but they paid a lot of money for this daughter of Munnings, and the switch to dirt definitely made a big difference for her.
It sure did. And I often wonder a lot of these times with Wesley Ward, he seems to put almost all his horses on turf. But we've seen him have some success with some that don't work out when they move to dirt. And this one certainly seemed to like that surface a lot more. Now, maybe it was just second start. She was a lot more comfortable, but she ran a big speed figure, 105 from Timeform US, won by over 5 lengths. And I like that she did it. She was able to sit back a little bit. She didn't exactly break super sharp like a lot of these Wesley Ward horses do. So it's not like she just outbroke the field and ran away. She had a, was able to track horses a little bit and just a good solid speed figure that says stakes races are probably in her future.
Yeah, I thought she ran well to win this race very decisively. Also, a good effort from the runner-up, Colonial Rose, who had shown some speed in the morning for Al Stall, and she put in a good effort to be second here by a clear margin. The big disappointment was Camera, who was just a total no-show. Got bet down to 3 to 5 here off some impressive workouts, a big sales tag, and just none of the talent that we saw in the morning in evidence in the afternoon. So one that I imagine we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and regroup with her. Let's move on to Del Mar. Obviously, they opened their meet this past week on Friday. We saw stakes racing throughout the first 3 days of the Del Mar meet. I think we're going to discuss the features from all 3 of those days. On Saturday, they ran the Grade 2 San Clemente. This one, 43-year-old fillies going the mile distance on the turf, Greg. And I think we've seen a pretty impressive turf 3-year-old out there in Anna Zett, who is now 2 for 2 in this country. And she was a dominant winner of this race, coming from off the pace under a good ride from Umberto Rispoli.
Yeah, I don't have the official speed figure for this one. I'm guessing it's going to be around a 110, which is pretty good. We already talked about the Chad Brown horse running a 114, so not too far off that. And if you watch this race, I wouldn't be surprised if there's not more in the tank with her. As you said, she was absolutely dominant in this field. Her finishing kick was something to behold because she was kind of lost in the shuffle early, even turning for home. She was kind of in mid pack, and when she got clear, she just exploded through that gap, and I really liked what I saw from her.
Yeah, watching these opening week races at Del Mar, you're kind of reminded of how much trips really do matter over that Del Mar turf course. You need to save ground on the turns and get out in the stretch because it is such a short straightaway run to the wire. And I thought Rispoli did everything right on this horse. I mean, saved ground on the turns, started to angle out just as they came into the straightaway, and obviously also was sitting on the best horse. She was able to win this race very decisively. And, she had shown some tendencies to get a bit rank in her first start in this country. Not the case in this race. She settled much better and really finished, so definitely a talented runner for the Leonard Powell barn. The Sunday feature at Del Mar was the Wicker Stakes. This one, I think, going that same mile distance on the turf course for the older horses, and the old class horse De Jour for Bob Baffert able to get the the winning trip here, and it was a bit of a heart-pounding trip for a while, as it looked like Juan Hernandez had nowhere to go in the middle of the stretch, was stuck behind horses, but he was committed to saving all that ground, and eventually the hole opened up, and De Jour had enough horse to get on through and scoot up the inside for victory.
He did, and he's a horse who I think's had a couple tough trips, the deceptively tough trips in his last couple. But when he's able to get a good run, he delivers. It's going to be about a 120, 121 time form US speed figure for the effort. And as you said, talking about trips at Del Mar, if he didn't get through, it could have wound up being another one of those fifth beaten 5 lengths, 114 speed figures. But he got the trip this time and got the job done. And I think he's a little bit underrated on the turf, and I wouldn't be surprised if, especially in California, he could win some of those graded stakes at a mile.
Yeah, he's a horse that I thought had a lot of potential when he first came back off the layoff earlier this year. He's been a little disappointing having not won a race until now, but I think you saw the potential when he was able to unleash that big late kick once he finally got through. It all did work out for him in the end. I think also a good effort from the runner-up Flavius, who was a huge price in this race. I mean, he's an 8-year-old now, has plenty of back class from when he was in the Chad Brown barn, but this was his third start off a long layoff of his own, and he definitely took a big step forward here, and he didn't get that rail run, was wider into the stretch, but still able to stay on at the end. So I don't think he has as much upward potential as a horse like De Jour, but I thought he ran well for the runner-up spot.
Yeah, he definitely has the back races to get to, and sometimes we forget about these older horses on turf. They can stick around a lot longer, as we've seen over and over again.
The traditional opening day feature at Del Mar on Friday was the Oceanside Stakes, this one going the 1 mile distance again on the turf course, this one for the 3-year-old males, and it was the Phil D'Amato Exacta here as Conclude able to hold off the more heavily favored Classical Cat, as these two both took some money, but 9-2 winner Conclude was able to get the jump on his stablemate and win this one. And Craig, it was a pretty fast pace for the opening quarter. Conclude had to sort of relax off a run-off leader into that clubhouse turn, but he was able to get the jump on the others and just had too much in the tank at the end.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what happened. He was able to get the jump. He's a horse who's been running in sprints, and he was able to use that sprint speed while still handling the two turns well. So he ran his career best speed figure in here, 113, just a 1 point improvement off his sprint down the hill last time. But he's a horse with some ability, and that tactical speed really helped him out in this spot. And we haven't really mentioned it, but a lot of why these you need trips in these Del Mar turf is because they are putting together some awesome betting races with big fields, and it's really good to see. I don't know if they'll be able to keep it up for the whole meet, but opening weekend was just a really nice time for bettors, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're able to do that when you sort of take a little bit of a break in the calendar, give these turf horses a rest, and, just have a lighter schedule at Los Alamitos since the Santa Anita meet closed. But boy, the racing office did a great job for this opening week to put together these cards. And I agree, it'll be interesting to see if they can keep it going or how long they can keep it going for. I think in this day and age in racing, you do expect a lull at some point, but they put together some awesome cards and great betting races. Hopefully the stewards get less involved than they did this past weekend, but we won't get into that too much. No, a great opening weekend at Del Mar. One more race to discuss from that venue was a Friday allowance race on that opening day card. Actually, the last race of the day, race 10, sticking with the turf race, this one going a little bit longer, the 1.125 distance. And Craig, the winner of this race, Twist, obviously very impressive. I don't know what was going on this day. I mean, obviously, neither of us were on site. It'd be interesting to know if there was some sort of lighting issue with the position of the sun that was causing an issue, because there were 3 horses that did not corner in this race, one of which was Twist, who just seemed to, I don't know if he noticed something or was distracted coming into the stretch. He veered out badly coming into the final 3 furlongs of this race and, turning for home, just blew the turn and then was veering out again through the stretch. But to win as easily as he did, despite that, this is obviously a horse with some talent.
He does, and he showed some of that talent in his first start in the country for John Sadler. He ran a good second, coming off, closing into really slow fractions to just be beaten a length. But he exploded here all the way to a 121 time form US speed figure and did so despite the antics you mentioned. I couldn't tell watching the replay what really happened. Maybe, yeah, we'll have to take the social media, see if anybody can help us out or let us know when they listen to the show. But this horse has some real talent, and I won't be surprised at all if he's able to win graded stakes in Southern California.
Speaking of horses with real talent, let's move on to another venue. We'll just discuss one race this week from Ellis Park, and it's a good one. A 2-year-old maiden race that they ran on Friday, won impressively by Timberlake. And Craig, this is a horse that was coming out of a very strong maiden race. I think one we had also discussed on this podcast, won by that good Norm Cassie horse. And Timberlake, not really competitive that day, but got to go a slightly longer distance here, stretching out to the 7 furlongs, and was like a completely different horse in his second start. I mean, he was powerful right from the start and just continued to put distance on this field.
Yeah, it was impressive when I went to make the speed figures for this day, and me and my assistant kind of alternate with Ellis Park, just depends on the day of the week. So I had to go take a look and see who was this horse because the speed figure almost didn't make sense when you looked at it. There was another maiden race for 2-year-olds on the card, and it was just way faster. But when I watched it and looked at all the other races, I just couldn't find any reason not to give it the figure that it earned on the clock. And that wound up being a 113. And that was about as conservative as I could possibly be. It did give some of the other horses in second and third pretty big jump ups, but it just fits on the day. And when you watch it, it's hard to really argue with the speed figure.
Yeah, it was a big effort from the winner, whatever the speed figure, deserves to be. This horse obviously ran a big race just to put the distance that he did between himself and the rest of this field. Took a big step forward in the second start for Brad Cox, obviously, added distance played into that. But, Craig, Ellis has developed such a reputation for being this speed-biased highway. I think legitimately so. It's deserved. But when I look through the results charts from this Friday card, Timberlake is the only horse on the dirt that won on the front end. It wasn't like this is one of those extremely speed-favoring days. It's obviously not color-coded that way in Timeform US. It doesn't seem like the other races played that way, so I'm not going to just regard this as some kind of fluky Ellis Park effort. This horse might be pretty good. And, as for his breeding, he's kind of got a similar pedigree to Extra Anejo in the sense that he's by into mischief with this really interesting European dam side pedigree. I think the dam's by looking at Lucky, but the bottom side of the pedigree, it's all European stamina breeding. The dam's a half to a horse named Thomas Chippendale, who was a winner of the Group 2 Hardwick, going 1.5 miles on the turf. So he feels like one that might have even longer races in his future.
Yeah, and I mentioned that other 2-year-old race, which was the exact same condition, 7 furlongs. It was 2.5 seconds faster than that one. So it was quite the run from him. And yeah, I really look forward to seeing this one. I don't remember all the speed figures. I'll have to look it up, but this has to be near the top we've seen from a 2-year-old so far.
And let's close things out on this podcast with a race that I know you wanted to discuss, Craig. A race from Prairie Meadows on Sunday, an allowance optional claiming event with a $30,000 tag attached. And that $30,000 tag did apply to the winner of this race, Topper T, who just was in a different zip code than this field at the wire, winning by nearly 20 lengths. And an old, classy horse got in against an overmatched field, and we saw what he could do.
Yeah, it was one. I mean, I didn't really want to talk about this race when I set out, but it's an Iowa bred optional claimer. But this horse just ran off the screen and then some. He's going to get the best speed figure of the week, a 127. And there was no way really when I sat down to make the speed figures that I could knock it down other than just assuming he couldn't possibly run that fast. But this is a horse that he's 7 years old. He has shown a lot of talent in his career, and he was left all alone on the front end, setting a pace slower than he had been in his last couple starts. And once that happened against overmatched competition, he just blew everybody away, won by, I think, almost 20 lengths in this field. And just figure anytime I give out a 127 Timeform US speed figure, it's something I want to discuss. I think it's a legit speed figure. Do I think it means he could ship to Saratoga and win a grade 1? No, of course not. Class has a lot to do with it. The company keeps a horse that ran second, Justice Streak. He's fine. He only got a 92 Timeform US speed figure. So just one of those anomalies where everything goes the right way for a horse. He was feeling good and ran the big number.
Yeah, Andy Beyer wrote an article about this race on the Daily Racing Form site that you can check out. I mean, he gave this horse a similar number to what you did, Craig, a 110 Beyer. The TimeformUS final time number was a 129. So, I mean, you guys are right in line with the speed figures. And he was kind of writing, you kind of have to give this race the big number as a speed figure maker, while also knowing you're never going to see it again. And he was kind of, comparing this horse to his sire, Bellamy Road, who kind of a similar situation, got perfect circumstances against overmatched horses to run a gigantic speed figure in the Wood Memorial. And, one that we never saw again from him, although he did run well in some other races, never won another race. And it's a similar situation with Topper T, like you said. Probably not a horse that has graded stakes in his future. You're not going to see him run this kind of race against real horses. But when the circumstances are perfect for a horse with back class like this, sometimes we can see an outlier speed figure come out of them.
Yeah, and the amazing thing to me, and something you talked about off air, is this horse was in for 30,000, and when you look at his PPs, it's amazing to me he didn't get claimed. Like you said, Ed, he showed up and ran with these PPs in a $30,000 claiming race at Saratoga. There had probably been 20 people in for him.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely a lot of claims going on at Saratoga right now, most of them being picked up by Linda Rice, but she was not on the podcast this week, so we won't discuss her too much. Well, Craig, that wraps up our recap of last weekend's racing. A lot on the calendar from last week, and I think a lot to look forward to in the coming weeks. That's just the way the racing calendar is for the rest of the summer, with Del Mar and Saratoga both running on the weekends. We've got big stakes to look forward to this week. There's Grade 1 action at Saratoga. They'll be running the Jim Dandy, that other prep for the Travers. So we'll talk about what we're going to do on the TimeformUS forecast a little later in the week. I would imagine I'll lean towards Saratoga this week, but we'll see how that card comes up. And looking forward to the rest of the summer, Craig.
Yeah, definitely. And you didn't even mention Colonial. They have the Arlington Million and Beverly D this year. So just lots of big racing coming up as always. I never look too far ahead. I have enough work to do without getting too far ahead of myself. But I know the Jam Dandy is this weekend. So certainly looking forward to that one.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.